I've got this is just kind of weird. Cami Rice is a colleague from the international community, and she lives in Normandy, like the Normandy. Uh, and so that's kind of the nice thing about the international community. We've got people all over the world. But besides being a freelance journalist, she's also very much involved in bringing refugees in from Afghanistan. In fact, she was in Washington talking to people up on the Hill. And from her perspective as both an activist in terms of refugees, but also as a journalist, I thought it would be great to have her talk about some of her work with refugees and the coverage of how the process goes. And maybe there are a few things that can be done that our news organizations might be able to do, or we might be able to do to help. So basically, I just want to turn things over to Cami and let her talk about what she's doing, and then open it up for questions.
Well, thank you all for letting me join you from my friend's car somewhere in Maryland. Um, so I leave tomorrow to go back to France. So it's great to catch you all in real time, or not a weird time in France to speak with you. It's been a really interesting ride the last 2.5 years. No, to get into this work completely unplanned. I've worked around refugee issues in a variety of contexts prior to this. In Nashville, I've helped with English classes for refugees, done some travel and work, journalism work that had me in refugee camps or interacting with immigrant communities. So that was some of the precursor to this. And then Christmas 2019, I spent in Kabul with some friends who worked for an NGO there. So I did a security training before I went. And when everything went crazy, when Kabul fell to the Taliban in August 2021, the person who heads up the security agency that I did the training with was like, "Hey, are you okay? Are you in Afghanistan?" I'm like, "No, I'm fine." And she's like, "Well, do you know any journalists who need seats on a Reuters flight out of Afghanistan?" I'm like, "Well, if I've got access to seats, I'll find some people to help fill them." And that is what was the beginning of 2.5 years of ongoing, continuing work. So I have a small team, and we are doing active casework still. We've got some folks that we're still working through getting them to safe places and through the visa processes. And then I've been doing advocacy on the Hill, like Dan said, here, just talking to offices about the Afghan Adjustment Act. And I think one of the challenges of, if it has felt at sometimes, there are lots of hard things going on in the world and lots of stories that need attention. I think one of the frustrating things for those of us working in this Afghan space specifically is it just felt like, a few months after the Taliban took over and things were not settled in Afghanistan, and they still aren't, obviously. The Ukraine war started, and it just felt like the world's attention shifted. And even, the U.S. made it much easier for Ukrainians to get into the U.S. under humanitarian parole in an emergency situation. Afghans were allowed to apply for that, but it was something like $500 per person, which is a lot of money for Afghans. And most of those applications were not adjudicated in any way. So it felt a bit like a scam, whereas the Ukrainians weren't even required to pay and were allowed to come into the U.S. And that's just the beginning of some of the contradictions in policy that are maybe slowly beginning to be rectified. And then, because they happen to happen around the same time, the Ukrainians' story has provided a foil for what's happened with Afghans. And, Ukraine's neighbors welcome them, whereas Afghanistan's neighbors have not welcomed them in terms of fleeing to a safer place or a place where their visas could be processed. That's been one of the parts of this story, is that the U.S. doesn't have an embassy in Afghanistan, and none of the developed, like, Western safe countries, democratic countries have embassies in Afghanistan. So in order for people to be processed to come to other countries, they have to get to a third country. And most of those third countries won't welcome them. And so that's been one of the big challenges of this story. I think in terms of journalistic coverage, we've certainly seen it slip off of the front pages. It is in the news, but because we're watching for that news, we see those stories. But I think the general public doesn't know that, like, regularly those of us working in this ecosystem hear people saying, oh, that's still a problem. Like, there's still Afghans who need to get to safety. Like, we didn't know. We aren't hearing about it, so we thought it was fine. And then one of the other challenges is we've been working on this Afghan Adjustment Act, and immigration is such a fraught issue in America. And I think there's still a lot of room to educate Americans about all the different forms of immigration. There are refugees. What does it mean to be a refugee? Illegal immigration. What does that look like? Like, what is that really? What's the distinction, and other forms of ways that people come to the US? I think that's one of the reasons that that allows some disinformation or some like extremist views on immigration, is because there isn't always enough context or education in our media in really clarifying all the different forms of immigration and ways that people come to the US and what it means. So that's a little start, I guess, to see what other questions Dan or the rest of you have.
It's really interesting, and the contrast with the Ukrainian refugees is interesting. I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both.
No.
And so it's how do we cover it? I run a community newspaper, and we actually did do a story on Afghan refugees who were being brought in by Lutheran social services, who do a wonderful job, but unfortunately they were placing them with some really bad apartments where they had terrible living conditions of children, with bed bug bites all over them, and rodents running rampant in their apartments, and a baby hit by a rat in their crib. And it's like these people have come from this country, and they come to our country, and this is they're thinking they have refuge, and this is how they're treated.
Yeah, and it is good to cover those stories, and they're coming at a time of a housing crisis, which has made this extra complicated. Also, the resettlement agencies had been drastically defunded, so it was this perfect storm problem of resettlement agencies defunded, and then suddenly having this massive influx of people. And some of that is beginning to be ironed out. Like, they've been given new funding, they've rehired, and it takes a while to train people and all that. So what we're seeing is that some of those initial problems, and even the processing pipeline through the State Department, the DHS, PRN, all the government agencies that process various portions of the immigrants to the US, those pipelines are being better staffed, and are the process is improving, which is huge. So that I think there some of the stories that are interesting too are like there's the initial arrival, and then checking in, how are people doing now, and the kind of check-ins, and some of that, I think there's a perspective, of course, like even I worked with immigrants, and what has been astounding, sobering to me, to work with people. I've worked with people after they arrive in the US, but to be working with people as they're fleeing their country, which we don't always get that story. So we have this image of like immigrants and refugees as these poor people who arrived with nothing. Well, part of the reason they arrived with nothing is because they had to flee, and you're only allowed to take 12 pounds of luggage with you on your evacuation flight, if you're lucky, if that's how you flee. And so they might be middle-class families. Even in Afghanistan, there were very wealthy and middle-class families who were suddenly forced to flee. So you arrive with this impression of being someone who is viewed as someone without a lot of access or resources or anything to contribute to your community. But that's not actually how these folks, and that's not unique to Afghans, but getting to witness it on both sides, I'm pretty world aware, and I was still kind of shocked by how, oh, this is how you get those images of people arriving with nothing, is that they're having to flee urgently, not allowed to take their backpack through the Taliban checkpoint. So they don't even get that with them as they arrive, and they arrive with nothing. And so I think kind of giving that helping people get past the image that we have of refugees as these just takers on, or this burden on society. And I think the Afghan community in particular, because so many of them worked with US organizations, so they understand how US companies operate. So they're actually able to slide in even more easily than other immigrant communities into US jobs, like much more seamlessly, which makes them an interesting population. With just that part of their story is different because they worked with US organizations.
How many more refugees do you think there are who helped the US who are trying to get out?
There are tens of thousands of people. I need the number. I need to get the current number, but we've just been advocating. Part of what I was on the Hill for last week, we were trying to get 20,000 more special immigrant visas authorized in the spending bill that looks like it's going to pass, the appropriations bills. The Senate had authorized 20,000. The House had authorized 0. The special immigrant visa program for people who worked alongside our troops, who like interpreters, but other roles, even like electricians on Army bases, on military bases, qualify. And there were 7,000 of those visas. They have to be reauthorized by Congress and each for another fiscal year for that program to continue. And they're given a certain number of visas. Those visas, because processing is improving, they were down to 7,000 of those visas for this fiscal year. So I have a family, my team and I in Afghanistan, who are like watching the news, and they're texting me. They're already in distress. They've just had a baby. They've been waiting 1.5 years to get out since they're interview ready, which is the next step in the process, but they had to leave Afghanistan to interview. They have been waiting for 1.5 years. Their baby's finally been born, so now they can move. And he's texting me saying, we've got to get out, like before, in case the administration changes and all the visa and resettlement stuff is defunded again. And there's now only 7,000 visas. So even if we get an interview and are approved, there might not be a visa left. So it's adding distress to them because they're watching the news here and tracking this stuff. So we were able to get the 12,000 visas into this appropriations bill, which is, I think, one of the first re-up of visas since Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. And we need tens of thousands more, but at least this will get us through this fiscal year.
I'm wondering, how difficult are the Taliban making it for people who are trying to leave the country? I would imagine that those people trying to leave almost have a target, aimed at them to try to prevent them from leaving. Would that be the case?
In some cases, I need to make sure what I'm allowed to say. The State Department, we have to be very careful, those of us in this ecosystem, how we talk about those flights. So people are being moved out of the country to process for their visas to the US and to other countries. They go to a third location and do their interview there before they enter the US. Countries are having to work. The Taliban know people are leaving. So some of those people they are allowing to leave. And that's where it gets tricky in all the oversight. And like, is the US government working with the Taliban, a terrorist organization? It's impossible. They're the de facto rulers of the country. So it's impossible. You can't do these things without them knowing. There are some people are able to leave. And we have to call them relocation flights because we have to not draw tons of attention to them. So that's what's tricky with media coverage as well. Because I think it's partly in the Taliban's interest to let the people who maybe would rise up against them leave the country. So there is some self-interest on the Taliban's part to let these people leave. But there are others who do still have a target on their back. And for those people, going to get a passport from the passport office is dangerous. And so there's a lot, like when the authority who is searching for you is also the one who runs the passport office, and you have to show up there with all your identification, it makes things really, really complicated to get out of the country. So there are certainly, and it's still, there are people in danger. I think one of the challenges in this story as well is, I have a French friend who is a photographer, journalist, artisty person, traveler. She lived in Afghanistan for 10 years. She evacuated with the French and has returned. And so as a woman, she's working there. She's doing a project. She's on a book, a photo series on Afghans and flowers. She's working on a documentary film. She's able to operate okay there. But so she's like, it's, in some ways it's a little bit safer there in some ways now, but the Taliban is unpredictable. And so it's hard to cover. So there are terrible things happening. Women are oppressed, but it's hard. She said it's hard to tell a true story because you look like you're siding with the Taliban if you say anything semi-positive about them. But it's also, so the dangerous pieces are true while some of the calm down pieces are also true. And to tell that nuance of a story is really complicated in this day and age where people want a straight story, black and white story. And the story isn't black and white.
So just briefly, we have about 5 more minutes that we can devote to this conversation. I think we could easily, talk for a really long time, but we've got some other meeting business we have to get to. So other people want to ask questions?
What do you need any, does your organization need financial help aside from coverage? Are there other ways that just those of us hearing this can make more people aware of what's going on?
Yeah, I think one of the things is advocacy. We are still trying to get this Afghan Adjustment Act passed. It's a bipartisan bill. Same bill in the House and the Senate. We have 16 senators and 46, I think, 40 some House members who are co-sponsors, equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats in both houses. So we are still trying to just get the word out about that. It has to be attached to a bill, a must-pass bill, and so it's looking less and less likely that we're going to get it through this Congress. But I'm an eternal optimist. So the more word we can get out about that, and if we, have to, it was introduced in the 117th Congress. We had to reintroduce it in this Congress. It's a standard piece of legislation that happens after. We've done that after Vietnam, after Iraq, after Cuba, I think Romania or Hungary, somewhere in Eastern Europe. It's for all the people entered under humanitarian parole, they cannot stay in the U.S. unless they don't have a right to long-term status in the U.S. unless we pass this legislation or they apply for asylum. And the asylum courts are mega backlogged. So this is legislation, and it's also there's another angle on this is mental health for our veterans and service members who are like, we fought in this war, and these people were with us. So that's one piece, is just coverage and about or getting the word out about the Afghan Adjustment Act and encouraging support for that. There are, like my team, we have a family that we're looking. There's a private sponsorship pathway opening now. My family has my team has a judge and his family. He had no pathway to the U.S., but now there is a pathway for them to come, and we're working to set up private sponsorship for them. And that means we have to raise $2,500 per person in the family to cover the money, the resettlement funds the U.S. government normally supplies for the first 3 months in the U.S. Those will now come from private sources. So like my team and other teams in the ecosystem that I'm part of are looking for funds for a variety of things, sustenance for people back in Afghanistan, but also these private sponsorship pathways that are opening up. So I could definitely connect you with some options for financial donations on that front, if that's what people are interested in.
Okay, Cam, if you can give me some of that information, I can pass it on to the board.
Okay.
Randy, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, well, on a different topic, but related to what you're here for, Cami, is I'm just wondering in the few seconds we have left, I know time is short, but can you give some insight into what you mean by things are not black and white and how it might be difficult to do the reporting or even discussing nuances?
Yeah. So I think because I've been trying to watch, and I've a lot of Afghan friends who have people back in Afghanistan, and so like the reporting about women, it sounds like they can't leave their houses at all. Well, from what I'm hearing, they can. You can leave and go to shops and stuff in Kabul. So there is some movement that people are doing. So to say there, but at the same time, the situation for women is they can't go to school. They're like feel like they have no options. So like it's like both things are true. And to just focus on women are just trained in their, shut up in their houses isn't necessarily 100% true in all cases. But if you say, oh, women, it feels like if you say anything positive about women being able to move, then you're taking away the impact of the story over how bad the situation is for women in Afghanistan right now. So things are day to day, from what I understand, are actually, there's a bit less violence overall in day to day life. But the Taliban are unpredictable. And if you worked for the Taliban before, they're still disappearing people who never show up again. So that's where you don't want to suggest that it's calm and no problem there anymore, but also paint an accurate picture of day to day life is a little bit of the nuance that's hard to get at.
Thank you. I wonder if we could hear briefly from Will Schick, a veteran board member who has served in Afghanistan.
I just want to say thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in this space. I don't think I think even just throughout the United States involvement in Afghanistan, the broader country has been fairly ambivalent to what's happening. And I know that there's a few group of Americans and other allies that are doing work in this space that I think is going underappreciated. And there's like a very small group of people that are shouldering the burden of a lot of this. And I know when there were like even the months, I can talk forever about Afghanistan, but even but there are lots of veterans who are also affected by withdrawal in terms of like we have relationships with people, and many of us have received pictures of like dead folks and things like that. And so like the work you do in this space is really important. Yeah, having tried to go through the humanitarian parole process myself with some folks I know, it's incredibly, the whole thing is very frustrating. So thank you for the work. Yeah.
You're welcome. I think, and maybe just another a couple quick things. There is a poll that has been done that I can send to Dan as well, that with Honor, one of the veterans organizations operating in the political sphere, did that. It's like 80%, 90% of Americans are in favor of us doing more for Afghan allies. And so it's frustrating when Congress is not responding to those voices. And there was something else I was going to say, but now I lost my train of thought. Anyway, I'm not sure. I don't remember now what the other thing is that I was going to say. But yeah, I can get that link to Dan as well. Oh, maybe just, I think one of the frustrating things in watching some of the oversight hearings and stuff is that because of the political sphere we're in, we also have a lot of, it's either blame Biden or blame Trump. It is a multi-administration failure. And we need oversight on these things. And it's frustrating because it just gets so swamped into political things. And so I think any way that coverage can continue to hold all of our administrations accountable on this, that's also important. Like Biden was holding the reins when it fell apart, and he needs to be held accountable for that. Trump, had the bad deal with the Taliban and set things up, and then there's the administrations prior to that. So it's not any parties, no one's hands are clean.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I think we could easily go for another half hour, but I'm not sure that our board members can stick around for the
Give
other
the
side.
time.
But please do send any follow-up stuff to Dan. It's an issue I personally am really very interested in, and would love to sort of keep in touch in what you're doing.
Thanks, and just thank you all. Thanks for being journalists in DC, and thanks for welcoming me to speak with you for a bit tonight.
Thank you so much. This was really good.
Thanks a lot,
Yeah,
Cami.
thank
Have a good flight.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay
Bye.
safe.
Thank you.